This year, I finally did it. I bucked up and bought my first set of real walkie-talkies. I'm calling them real because they aren't those little Motorola ones you buy your kids for Christmas. No, they're full-on radios with programmable channels and long-range communications, like the ones the ski guides use. You might be able to tell I kind of wish I was a ski guide. I bought the walkie-talkies as another layer of safety since my wife and I are starting to venture a little further off the beaten path during our backcountry ski touring adventures. Also, there's nothing more Canadian to me than good radio banter. I love talking to people through the radio, and it's an essential piece of gear if you're blazing trail. Nearly a century ago, Donald Hings blazed trails of another kind when he invented the tool I'm all excited about here in my intro. That's right. Way back in the 1930s, Hings, who lived right here in the basin, invented the walkie-talkie. Growing up in Roslyn in the 1920s and 30s, Hings was obsessed with the relatively new marvel of the radio. At 14, he started tinkering and built his own radio sets. By his early 20s, he had helped establish the first radio station here in the Kootenays. But he was just getting started. In 1930, Hings was working in trail for the Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company of Canada Limited. Bit of a mouthful, later known as Cominco, when they asked if he could help their planes communicate with their workers on the ground. Within a year, Hings had a company plane tapping Morse code to a telegraph station in Nelson. By 1937, Hings had developed a portable emergency voice radio transceiver he called the Pack Set. Now those planes could talk to people on the ground at a whopping range of 209 kilometers. He was about to patent his invention when the Second World War broke out, and Hings, a do-goodin' trailblazer from the Kootenays, donated his technology to the Canadian military. 18,000 walkie-talkies of Hings' design were made during the war. And because of its superior capabilities, many think it helped turn the tide in favor of the Allies. I'm Mitchell Scott, Editor-in-Chief at Kootenay Mountain Culture Productions, and this is the first episode in our third season of The Headwaters. Brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. The Kootenays are awash in trailblazers, and in this episode we follow people who travel outdoors where others have not. Whether you're climbing mountains, descending rivers, or accomplishing incredible feats, Trailblazers, please, just make sure you don't forget your walkie-talkies.
Jamie Moy from Mitchell Scott, what's your 20 over?
This is Jamie. I'm right across the studio from you, Mitchell, over.
That's a big 10-4, Jamie. Commence podcast on Trailblazing, over.
Adventure journalist and senior Kootenay Mountain Culture correspondent Jamie Moy will be leading us through our trailblazing episode. We're going to start with an exploration in the mountains just outside of Nelson, British Columbia. Apparently in this province, anyone has the right to name a mountain. You just need to be the first to step up and claim it. In this story, we're going to go find an unnamed mountain, and we're going to summit that mountain, and then we're going to try to give it a handle. Jamie, hello, and welcome back to the Headwaters Podcast.
Hi, Mitch. Thanks. It's great to be here again.
So, to be the first to name a mountain is quite the novel idea here.
Yeah, it started with my friend Douglas Noblet. He has a bird's eye view of the mountains around here because he's part of Nelson's search and rescue and also a pilot.
He's also an amazing aerial photographer, and you'll regularly see his shots in our magazine.
Yes, that's the guy. And in the summer, he flies for BC Wildfire. You know, like scouting from the sky, looking for fires in the wilderness. And he also takes people up on flight seeing tours. So he sees tons of mountain peaks from the sky. He told me most of them don't have names.
We should have pretty good viz with the higher cloud, but on like a bluebird day, you could probably see 100 or 200 kilometers in every direction, and it's just a sea of mountains. The main peaks will obviously have a name, but then there's sub peaks around that. There's smaller peaks lower down, bumps. Like where's the line between a peak, a mountain, a hill? But yeah, I think it's safe to say that most or many summits, don't have a name.
That's Douglas talking about the western half of the Nelson Range.
Wait, how do you know if a mountain has a name or not?
Well, you'd see the name on things like Google Maps, but more officially, in British Columbia, we have a Geographical Names Office. It's a government entity under the Ministry of Forests, and it has a database that tracks the names for everything. Rivers, lakes, mountains, beaches, bays, you get the idea, Mitch. And there's a place you can go online and look at a map and view all of the official names.
So things like Mount Loki and Bugaboo Spire, those iconic Kootenay peaks, they'd all be in there.
Yes, exactly. If something doesn't have a name, the Geographical Names Office has a policy for how to submit a name and a process for accepting or rejecting it. Basically, anyone can nominate a name for any mountain in British Columbia. I find this fascinating.
Totally. It's incredible to think that any one of us could name a mountain.
I know. How is it possible that I can just go charging off into the wilderness and declare a name for a mountain? I decided to find out more about how this process actually works. So I recruited Douglas to take me up in his plane to scout for an unnamed peak.
You guys ready?
Ready?
Okay, so what did you see up there?
It's a pretty incredible vantage point. We took off at the Nelson Airport and flew south over Whitewater Ski Resort, headed toward Kootenay Pass. It was a nice, clear day, and as far as I could see, it was mountains. Just peak after peak after peak, like a sea of mountains.
So now begs the question, how could you possibly pick a mountain?
So Douglas has a GPS in his little white Cessna, and from the co-pilot seat, I could see pretty easily what was named and what wasn't. And he was right. Most didn't have names.
So you're just going for like blank spots on the map?
Well, pretty much. And we started flying loops around the more prominent peaks to find the best contender. We had two criteria, aesthetics and accessibility.
So aesthetics, and it's like this is a good-looking mountain.
Pretty much. We like ridgeline hikes, so we were looking for one with a nice ridgeline, maybe some nice little lakes around it to make for a really scenic view from the top. And we also wanted something we could do as a day trip from Nelson. So we were looking for things like an old logging road or a mining road, something that could get us reasonably close to the base by car.
You don't want to work too hard to name your own mountain here. So, okay, where is this aesthetic, nice, easy to access peak?
Have you heard of Panther Lake?
I haven't.
It's this small wreck site in the mountains east of Selmo, and there's a mountain up there called the Three Sisters. It's almost straight north from there, a couple of drainages up, just north of a peak called Elmo.
And then what?
Once we were back on the ground, I double-checked it against a geographical names database online to make sure it didn't have a name.
No name?
No name. Then we used Google Earth to plot what seemed like the most logical route to the summit. So here was the plan, Mitch. We'd start by driving to the town of Weimer, where we pick up a dirt road called Porcupine and follow it into the mountains. From what I could tell on Google Earth, we'd drive that road for about 15 kilometers, as close as we could get to the peak's base by car. Then we'd pull over and start hiking.
If it's an unnamed mountain, there's probably no trail to the summit, I would imagine.
Right.
Yeah, so what's the access like?
Right, so there's no trail. So we're basically trying to figure out the most straightforward way to get to the top through the wilderness. For the first 2 kilometers, we bushwhacked through a lot of alder, which is really thick and slow going. Once we gained the ridge, things opened up a bit and we could see the peak in the distance, which made it easier to navigate on the way up, and also with planning our eventual descent.
And I think on the way down, we should take the left skyline ridge, gain the call, and then down through the lakes. I think would be a nice, lovely loop.
Yeah, let's definitely do it as a loop.
We hiked about another 3 kilometers up the ridgeline to get to the top. Our total elevation gain was 700 meters. It was stunningly beautiful on the upper reaches of the ridgeline. There were deep blue alpine lakes off both sides and really jagged, craggy rocks. Mitch, you know that feeling you get sometimes when you're out in the wilderness and you start wondering if anyone else has ever seen what you're seeing, and it all just starts to feel so special and rare and unique? That's how it was.
I know that feeling. I often wonder if I'm the first person to ever walked on this little patch of earth. It's pretty magical.
It really is. But it didn't last. There was a surprise for us waiting at the summit.
We're here. Oh no, there's a cairn up here.
There's a cairn. I wonder if there's a secret peak name in here.
So somebody's been up here.
No way, a cairn. So people have been up there before. Was there a summit register, one of those canisters with a log inside of people who've ascended, or anything else with a name?
No, nothing like that. But it was a really well-constructed cairn. More like a small rock tower. We were clearly not the first people up there.
The Kootenay people get after it. They climb peaks, whether they're named or not.
In retrospect, it was kind of silly for me to think that we would be the first people up there. Of course, people had been there before. I mean, people in the Kootenays are so adventurous, and the peak is so picturesque and relatively easy to access.
You could say there's a whole bunch of trailblazers in the Kootenays. So if there's a cairn, there's got to be a name.
Well, it's funny. It turns out that naming a peak has nothing to do with who was there first. Once I got into the policy and the paperwork that you need to submit a name, I realized the process is different than I imagined.
This is sounding interesting.
The province's position on geographical place names is that not everything out there needs a name at this time, especially in the wilderness. A mountain peak really only needs a name once people start commonly referring to it. So, like, Weimer Peak has a name because it's the major peak overlooking Whitewater Resort, and everyone there can see it, and we tend to talk about it as a landscape reference. Or when we're going out into the backcountry. It's just more practical for our maps and our communications to have a name for it.
Which makes total sense. I'd hate to be at Whitewater pointing out Weimer Peak and just going, oh, that peak.
Yeah,
Needs
exactly.
Yeah.
So you don't just go out into the wilderness and summit a peak and name it for the sake of naming it. You need a valid reason why it should be named. In that way, the policy also helps ensure that future generations have the opportunity and privilege to name landscape features. The fact that there was a cairn on the unnamed peak that I summited actually helps make the case for naming it. It demonstrates that other people are engaging with this landscape feature. And if enough of them start doing it, it makes sense to give it a name.
Okay, so Mount Moy then? Or I've got it, Jamie Peak. Both have a nice ring to it.
Ha! I would not be opposed to that. But the province probably would. There are specific guidelines on the name. If you want to name it after a person, it needs to be someone from the community's history with a significant tie to the mountain. You can name it in commemoration of someone, but the person must have been dead for at least 2 years and can have died on the mountain, say in an avalanche. Oh, and you have to prove that they've contributed significantly to the area where the geological feature is located.
Sounds like they've got quite a few rules as part of the process. So what are you going to do? How are you going to name it?
Well, something I've learned through all this is that I probably shouldn't name it.
Oh, you're such a good person, Jamie.
No, really. The community should. I mean, my role as a person submitting the name is to reach out to local stakeholders and come to a consensus about, 1, whether we should name it at this point in time, and 2, what the best name would be.
Okay, so we gotta close the loop here. Next steps.
So I started by presenting all this to the Salmo Village Council.
We would like to thank you for coming and doing this and sharing that with us.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Lockwood, and thank you, councilors.
Thanks for coming.
One of the main questions I wanted to ask is if anybody here had an objection to us pursuing this, to me looking to name this peak and going through the process of engaging with the community to talk about naming it. I also wanted to ask if anyone knew of any local or anecdotal names that people called this peak.
What was council's reaction?
There were counselors who actually knew the peak I'd summited, and they agreed it saw enough regular use to warrant an official name. They assigned a resource on council to help me put together a list of key stakeholder groups to consult. The Sinaiacs recreation groups like the Kootenay Mountaineering Club and the Nelson Snowgoer Snowmobiling Club, Search and Rescue, and also the Darkwoods Conservancy because the peak is just inside their borders.
Okay, Jamie, the suspense is killing us. What's it looking like for the name?
I'm not done consulting everyone yet, but Mitch, I can share that the dirt road we drove on as far as we could to access the peak, it's called Porcupine Road. It follows Porcupine Creek, and one of the alpine lakes that we looked at from the summit, it's called Porcupine Lake. So Porcupine Peak is a really strong contender. The important thing is that it's a name that's logical and useful to the community who will be using it.
Everybody likes a porcupine. Jamie, Jamie, thank you. This has been fascinating and not what I expected. Is there anything else to mention? You're the first person I know who has attempted to name a mountain.
Yes, Mitch, I almost forgot to mention good taste. The policy explicitly states that geographical names should be in good taste.
Okay, good to know. That means I probably won't be naming a mountain anytime soon. Thank you, Jamie. The first ascent of a river is revered in the sport of whitewater kayaking. And first ascents are also increasingly rare. There are very few remaining wild rivers left in the world that haven't already been run. And one of those rare rivers is right here in the Kootenays. It's called the Incommoplew. It flows for nearly 70 kilometers through a remote, densely forested valley in the newly created Incommoplew Conservancy, which is in the Selkirk Mountains, southeast of the town of Revelstoke. In 2013, a group of locals led by Carl Jacks, a resident of New Denver, which is a town located over 100 kilometers south of the river, attempted to nab the first descent of the mighty Incommoplew. They succeeded. Sort of. Jamie Moy has that story.
A bigger, older expedition boat, so it's got a lot of room.
On the shore of Slocan Lake, New Denver resident Carl Jacks pulls his kayak from the back of his truck and slides it into the water. Carl's paddle strokes cut effortlessly through the water, revealing his expertise. It wasn't long ago that he was making bold first ascents of rivers and creeks throughout British Columbia. Now that he's a father of two, Carl's paddling days are considerably more mellow. But in 2013, he was still heeding the call to hair-raising adventure.
I swear you could hear voices, in the night. Just the sounds of ghosts crying for help or something. It was a little ominous, and it was a beautiful camp setting. After a horrendous day of hiking, because of the whole zone that it gobbled them up, it was just a staircase of mayhem, unpaddleable, and very difficult terrain to walk through, pouring rain.
Carl is talking about the week he spent on the Incommoplew River in September 2013. No one had ever run the Incommoplew in its entirety. Two paddlers had attempted it 10 years before him. They were woefully underprepared aboard sit-on-top kayaks and were swept away by the first major rapid. Their bodies never found. The photographer who was with them spent 6 days wandering through the forest searching for them before he was rescued. Some people, including Carl, had kayaked the river's lower section. There had been logging in that area, so there was some degree of road access, however crude. But the upper Incommoplew wasn't accessible by car. It remained a mystery, completely shrouded in old-growth temperate rainforest. For Carl, it proved irresistible.
Like I said, I came up in this conversation with friends that lived on the east side of the Rockies, and they had some background in alpine adventures, and they said, the Incommoplew, I wonder if that would be a pretty good adventure probably, and you could go in from one of the huts in the Rogers Pass and I don't know, I was just in the moment then and took that to a map book and looked at it and realized, yeah, that could be done. And I think, yeah, that sense of wanting to do something, be the first. Sure, kayakers are always ego-driven to have their first descent, logged of something. And there's not a lot of first descents left in this area, at least by navigable kayak.
Carl set out for his attempt with a team of 6 other paddlers and 1 photographer. They started on foot from Rogers Pass.
The hike in was unreal. It was. You were in it. You had 100-something pounds on your back, your kayak fully loaded with gear and food for 6-7 days, safety equipment, ropes, spare clothing, and it was a test. We figured around 3 days to get in, and it was 2.
After 2.5 days of arduous bushwhacking, they reached their intended put-in, but the river was not welcoming. Daily downpours made for flash floods and deadly water levels, with roiling rapids reaching Class 5 and even 6. In many instances, team members had to pull out their boats and walk. As challenging as it was to portage through the relentless old-growth understory, it was far too dangerous to paddle.
If it's nice, clean blue water, even white water, but when it's muddy and frothing with anger from rain that just didn't let up, then you got to take it and step back a little and hope that you're making the right decision to either walk the forest, which can lead to ankles and knees going, or putting in on the water.
It would take them another 4 days to paddle and portage their way down the Uncommaplu. Looking back today, from the tranquil waters of Slocan Lake, Carl is not certain he'd call it a first descent.
I don't know. Were we successful? I mean, we hiked a heck of a lot of woods with our kayaks, even along downstream. So you could say we were the first to complete our adventure as planned.
He doesn't regret his choice to play it safe. No one in his party died. And there's still uncharted adventure to be had on the Uncommaplu River for future generations of paddlers, like his kids.
Yeah, there's more to be had, for sure. It's getting the right water levels, the weather. We had a week of sunshine forecasted, only it turned out it rained in the valley that entire time, and there was no rain anywhere else in the Kootenays that week, so we didn't see that coming. But there's more left for people if they want it up there. Yeah, and a few paddlers have asked since, what's that canyon like? Well, I don't know. You got to just find out, I guess.
Some firsts make people famous, their names forever remembered for their groundbreaking achievements. When it comes to mountaineering, that person is Pat Morrow. Now in his 70s, Pat was the first person to summit the 7 highest peaks on each of the 7 continents. But before summiting Everest and Elbrus and Denali, a teenage Pat was making some firsts here in the Kootenays, where he grew up.
I come from the generation of climbers in Canada where almost everything you did was a first, because there hadn't been that many forays into the mountains in this part of British Columbia. And, climbers like me who grew up in these mountains, there were still a few peaks around that hadn't been climbed, and certainly there were many routes on those mountains that were more difficult than the original ascent routes. And so I came into it as a teenager back in the late 60s in Kimberley, and the very first among the first climbs I did was a climb near Mount Harrison, which is the furthest south 11,000 foot peak in the Rockies. It's up in behind White Swan Lake. And I was with the people who introduced me to climbing, Bob and Lila O'Brien. And again, we were doing it not to be first so much as to satisfy our curiosity and get out there.
It was a different world back then, but the quest to be a trailblazer continues today. We're going to leave the last word with Pat Morrill.
And so often people climb up a different route or a peak, an obscure peak, and they claim to be the first to do it. And so my question is, why do you go to those places? What's your motivation? And I think it has, personally, I think it has to be because you want to discover something about your world and also about yourself.
And that's our podcast. The Headwaters is brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. You can read all about the great work the Trust does for our community at ourtrust.org. You can also read more about these stories and see some amazing photography and imagery on our website at headwaterspodcast.com. I'd like to thank Jamie Moy for taking us on that epic trailblazing quest of Episode 1, Season 3. I'm Mitchell Scott. Thanks for listening.